Welcome to Industry in Progress. This is Paramount Advertising's latest study in support of content for change, and that builds on on-screen representation in media. We wanted to expand that to advertising. As an industry, we know we've made some major strides in inclusion. The events of 2020 were a turning point. We widened the aperture for inclusion for a lot of marginalized communities. But now we want to check in on that progress. We want to see how far we've come and the work that still needs to be done. So you're about to hear some hard truths. Want to give you a disclaimer. But ultimately, the end goal here is to really shine a light on what it means to achieve true inclusive representation in advertising. I am Shivani. I am joined by Michelle from the same team, and together we'll take you through a couple of top highlights from the study. And we come from the audience impact and intelligence team. So our remit is to power our ad sales teams, our partners, with insights that are audience forward, culturally fluent. And these insights can take many forms, including the thought leadership study that you're about to see, like this one, as well as white papers, trend reports, workshops to inspire big creative ideas. It spans the gamut. So let's get right into it. Why does representation matter? To see someone who looks like me in a TV show or a movie affects my sense of self. And a majority of consumers agree the way their identities are portrayed in media does influence perceptions about them in the real world. And we'll play this clip from Viola Davis. She talks about how seeing Cicely Tyson on screen impacted her.
Please explain why representation matters.
Because you need to see a physical manifestation of your dream. I'm sorry, I don't care what anyone says. And listen, I love so many actors out there. But there is something about seeing someone who looks like you that makes it more tangible. You could see it, you could touch it, and it gives you the possibility to look through your imagination and, you know what, redefine yourself.
Yeah.
Because I needed to redefine myself at 128 Washington Street. And the imagination is this infinite playing field where you can be reborn. And that's what I saw in Miss Tyson and her excellence. I saw a way out.
Yes.
You know, you got to see a way out. Someone has to provide a portal.
So to think of TV shows and movies as a portal for being reborn, that is powerful. The power of representation, though, doesn't just stop with entertainment. A lot of people agree that diversity, equality, and inclusion is equally important in advertising, followed by social media and podcasts. And why wouldn't it be, right? Advertising happens to be the most ubiquitous forms of content out there, and ads have the transform. They have the power to transform how the world sees people, just like TV and films. But we also know that representation in advertising has gotten a bit more complicated since, say, the 70s. This is a scene from an ad from 1971 called "I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke." A lot of us remember it from that time. Might even be the earliest example of inclusive advertising. But while for its time, any visibility of any marginalized identity was powerful, today it seems a little bit antiquated, and that's because consumer expectations of what inclusive portrayal should look like have also evolved. And with those growing expectations, brands are also increasingly afraid of getting it wrong. Boycotts and backlashes have become more frequent and intense. And from Pepsi to H&M to Bud Light and Disney, we've seen brands trying to be inclusive get caught in the crossfires of the culture war on both sides. So whether they're getting in trouble for racially insensitive portrayals or tone-deaf portrayals, but also even if you're immune to right-wing criticism, you might get in trouble for having inclusive company practices. So the landscape clearly has gotten a lot more, it has shifted dramatically over the past 3 years, and brands exist in a much more tense environment. So with that evolving landscape, it was important for us to ask, where do we go from here as an industry? How do we articulate why representation matters and what it takes to get there? And do consumers really see themselves represented in advertising? Do professionals have the tools they need to facilitate effective representation? And is there an ROI on inclusion? So these are just some of the questions that we set out with when we started the project. And we knew that our methodology had to be that much more intentional. So we wanted to take an expansive view of what inclusion meant and just go beyond, push our focus beyond just Black, Latinx, and Asian communities under race and ethnicity to include Native and Indigenous Americans, to include people who identify as LGBTQ+, neurodiverse, differently abled, as well as those belonging to religious minorities. And we had a multi-phase research approach, and there's a lot that we've been doing for the better part of 2023, including extensive qualitative. We have conducted in-depth interviews, mobile ethnographies, as well as a nationally representative survey of 3,600 consumers. Not only did we study consumers, we wanted to look inwards as an ad industry and understand its challenges. So we surveyed ad industry professionals, both on the brand side and the agency side, across media agencies, across creative agencies. And there's a lot that we uncovered. And we're about to take you through 4 of 6 of these chapters of sorts that the full study contains. And we're trying to do that in 15 minutes. So I'm going to pass it on to Michelle.
Thanks, Shivani. So let's get started with our first section, which is all about the ad industry being a work in progress. So this is about evaluating the state of diversity within advertising. Now, the events of 2020 really drove an increase in diverse representation. So when we take a look specifically at race and ethnicity, and we look at marginalized communities like Black, Asian, and Hispanic communities, so in 2019 to 2020, their representation increased significantly. However, we're seeing this pullback on that progress, right? We're seeing a decline in representation. So from 2021 to 2022, when we look at Black representation, it decreased from 16% to 14%. For Hispanic community, it decreased from 9% to 5%. And I do want to note though, however, when you look at white representation, it increased significantly, right? When you look at these charts. And the signal of this is really from the Super Bowl this year, where they had predominantly white cast members in the ad commercial. So just want to make a note of that, that we're seeing this decline happen recently. Now, when we look and take a double click on Hispanic representation, it has declined since pre-pandemic levels, right? So look at the representation from 2019 to 2022. It has decreased significantly from the beginning of 2020. And so it's really surprising because a lot of brands are really tapping into the Hispanic community because of their growth target, as far as their spending power and things of that nature. So you wouldn't think that the representation will be decreasing and it will be increasing. However, the numbers are saying something different. And they're really also the most proportionate to their population size. Once again, when we look at representation, Hispanic has a 5% representation presence in ads, but they represent 20% of the US population. When you look at other marginalized communities, it's a little bit closer with Black and Asian and LGBTQ+. But once again, when you look at white representation versus the total US population, you can see there's a discrepancy. And if you look at this chart, it's easy to see that there's more white representation in ads than there are in the US population. So I'll let that sink in. And that leads us really good to Representation 2.0, which is our next section. And this is really understanding evolving consumer expectation when it comes to representation. Now, I do want to note this quote because one of the consumers that we spoke to, Zinju, who is a blind bisexual woman from Wisconsin, she mentioned that the only thing worse than being represented is being misrepresented. And this is a sentiment that was shared across all of the consumers that we spoke to. So definitely wanted to point that out. And the negative stereotypes really have impacted how people are seen. So when we ask consumers how they see these different communities, these are the top 3 things that they said. For Black people, they're seen as poor, angry, and victims. For Hispanic people, poor, lazy, and victims. Gay and lesbian as sensitive, overly feminine, and overly sexual. For people with physical disabilities, sensitive, victims, and never involved in romantic relationships. And lastly, for Muslim as angry, villains, and also negative. So these are the top 3 ways that they're seeing these communities represented. And what I want to do is play this quick TikTok of a consumer who was just talking about how Latinos are represented in marketing, and I'll play that video.
We talk about how Latinos are represented in marketing. How come every Latino has to be like dancing or like with the chihuahua or something? Like, do y'all think I just like bachata my way, like everywhere I go. How come it's never just like, here are 3 homeowners and one of them is Latino? Here are 3 business owners and one of them is Latino. Here are 3 mothers. One of them is Latino. Because you know that's the truth, right? Did you know that 30% of Gen Z in America are Latino? A whole third. So why is it that we're still like, why does every woman have to be a Fanta woman? You know what I'm saying? They're getting us and they're showing us what they think of us in their marketing. So maybe we make a change.
Not maybe, we need to make a change, so just want to point that out. And so consumers really want advertisers to do better. Like, yes, they're noticing that advertisers are putting some money up to a lot of causes, but we want to play this video because these are the consumers that we spoke to, and I think they will say it better than I can. So I'll show you this video.
I just think in general in America that there's been a little bit of a shift where ethnic backgrounds have become much more to the forefront than it was in the past.
The media has changed a lot and they want to touch on different subjects. They don't always get it right.
I have yet to feel like seen in advertising. I'm sure I would cry. It doesn't take much to make me cry, but I'm sure I would.
The tropes are really hurtful. When the media does this,
I get tired of this sort of recurring pattern or theme that Black people only are athletes or entertainers. I think it does damage to Black people psychologically to constantly be faced with this stuff all the time.
Asians get portrayed to be this model minority, which one, it's a lot of pressure, and two, that's not okay. We're all people. There's not a standard Asian model, but the model that you see in mass media is a very small, petite, pale-skinned, like porcelain-skinned Asian woman with really dark black hair, a flat nose, cookie cutter Asian. And it drives me up the wall because I look nothing like that.
There's a lot of terminology finally coming up with these issues, like the super crip, which is where somebody's presented as doing something really great with a disability, but it's over exaggerated in its value. It almost would be better to not make it a national news headline because that should be just normalized.
There are billions of Arab people out there that want to see themselves represented.
I wish that media would include more people who are more real, have these big budgets, but I just wish that they would actually pay attention to the country or the actual communities, not just like actually do in-depth research.
I would like to believe that everybody's doing the best that they can, but sometimes there's just not enough research and understanding behind some of these ads.
So I think that's a great segue to our next section, which is all about the return on inclusion. So this is really shifting inclusion from being a moral imperative to a business imperative because it is so important. So inclusive advertising has really become inflated with social responsibility. If we think about the ads that started in 2020, right, there were a lot of just black boxes that were out there coming from ads. And so even ad professionals, we saw that 52% say that, you know, they would increase, if their company were to increase diversity, their company will be ideally socially responsible. So that's the idea that we need to shift just from, not from being just moral, but also a business imperative. And people notice brands that represent people like them. So 62% of consumers are more likely to notice brands that represent people like them. And this increased significantly across a lot of different marginalized communities. Also, inclusion drives purchase intent, right? They're willing to buy more from brands. They're willing to pay more from brands. And once again, this increases significantly across all the different marginalized communities. And a great example of this also too is Ben & Jerry's. I won't read the quote here, but one of the consumers mentioned that, you know, they are more inclined to buy from Ben & Jerry's because of the increased inclusion that they normally have over the years and that responsibility that they have from the past seasons. Also, it drives brand infinity. They're willing to recommend brands. They're willing to pay more for brands. Once again, this increases across marginalized communities. And I do want to definitely note here that this is a halo effect that's going on. So it not only is just directly targeted to, let's say, a person in the Black community, it affects everyone. And yes, it increases across marginalized communities, but I also want to note that white people want to see diversity in advertising too. As you look at the numbers, it's in close parallel to the rest of the marginalized community. So it's not really off-putting that white consumers want inclusive advertising. So everyone wants to see ads affecting people that look differently than them. And I'll pass it back to Shivani to take us to the next section.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, so we have looked at the state of representation in advertising. We've looked at what it takes to create inclusive portrayals. We know inclusion is good for people and good for business, and now you're probably asking, how do we get it right? We've said before that advertising, just like TV and films, is content. And our approach to transforming advertising should be as rigorous as the efforts that we're putting behind transforming content at Paramount, whether that is creating accurate portrayals that reflect audiences' lives, whether that is representation both behind and in front of the camera, or whether that's building cultural fluency and accountability so that we're ultimately transforming the content creation ecosystem. And that is what Content for Change is all about. And that became our inspiration and our starting point for thinking about advertising. And when we spoke to professionals, we heard over and over again that there is a lot of complexity around inclusivity, and they are hungry for extra guidance, for tools to facilitate good representation. They're finding it hard to talk to clients and agencies about the subject. And clearly, there's a case to be made for there is a gap to fill. And even a little bit of training would go a long way in impacting inclusivity in the long run. And so we built a toolkit. It serves as a set of takeaways for marketers who want to up their inclusivity IQ, whether that is with the inclusivity audit. So before you move forward as a brand, you want to diagnose your connection with the target. You want to see if you've earned the permission to speak to them. You want to look at how you can center D&I at the center of the research and insights approach with creative strategy. With creative executions, you want to work on crafting empowering portrayals and then amplify those narratives, champion those narratives in broader media with a good media strategy, and setting up clear, meaningful metrics, KPIs that are actually put in place before the launch of the campaign so that you're effectively measuring success. And you have a brand response plan. You're prepared as a brand to become a part of the cultural dialogue, whether that is in a positive or negative way, because you want to be prepared for both. And coming out of those principles that we just covered, we have clear actions that you can use to support each of these principles, whether that is a cultural fluency checklist, celebrating all kinds of lived experiences from universal to unique stories of these communities, to having a defense strategy or a brand ally action plan. So there is a lot more where that came from, and that at a glance was our industry in progress study. We urge you to scan the QR code to reach out to us if you're interested in seeing the full study, and we hope you have a great rest of your sessions. And please be sure to catch a research preview of Gen Alpha, which also happens at the same time tomorrow morning.
Thank you, everyone.